Eventually, the rural gave way to urban. More and more serfs began buying their freedom, and more towns began to get charters that would grant them a certain amount of liberty from the local lord. And the result was towns began to spring up. Fewer and fewer people became farmers, and more people became craftsmen. There was the shoemaker, the blacksmith, the tanner. All kinds of new professions began to take shape. The baker. Your book shows a picture of a European town on page 341, or European shops in a medieval town, where the different merchants were selling their wares. All right. So much for the social life in the Middle Ages. Now to get on with some of the episodes. Your book starts off with England and then goes from there to France, so I'll start off with England also. William the Conqueror conquered England. The year was 1066. Now William the Conqueror was a Northman, Duke of Normandy. The word Normandy means Northman. His father had gone on a crusade and had died while on the crusade. He had gone on a pilgrimage, but died on the pilgrimage. So young William became the Duke, even though he was still a boy. And young William used to play with the future King of England. And the future King of England promised young William, when I die, I will never marry. When I die, I'll pass my throne on to you. Well, the two men grew up. And it was true, the King of England did, in fact, marry, but he never had any children. He was more monk than he was king, and he did not ever consummate his marriage. So when the King of England died, the people of England made a man king who did not have what you call blue blood in his veins, whose ancestors had not been king, King Harold by name. And Harold was not descended from royalty at all, so he had no right to the throne. William said, hey, I was supposed to, besides, I'm related to the royal family anyway. So he collected an army, and his army went to England, and in a hail of arrows or whatever, your book shows a picture of it. William conquered England, took over, and from that day till this, all of the kings and queens of England have been descended from William the Conqueror. Now, folk, don't write this down, but this is somewhat on a personal note. One of the men who followed William was a man from Flanders named Warnevald. And as a result of Warnevald's service to William, William said to Warnevald, you go up here and you take a plot of land over here near Paisley, Scotland. This man took up residence in Paisley, took over the area, and married one of the girls from the area. This county he took over was called the County of Cunningham. That's the reason I'm telling the story, of course. He took the surname of Cunningham himself, and his descendants became the earls of the Cunningham County. They eventually got more land, and eventually they were granted titles of nobility, and the Cunningham clan was to rule the name was to rule this area until 1801, when the last Cunningham man died without a male heir, and he had not made provision for a woman to take his place. So the Cunningham County became dormant. The earldom of Cunningham became the dormant earldom. Now, am I related to him? Possibly. Here's why. I mean, all of you know, I'm going to digress a little bit. If someone were to offer you a penny today and doubling that tomorrow, 2, 8, 16, 32, 64 cents, $1.28 for 30 days, or $1 million outright, which would you take? The million outright or the penny doubling for 30 days? Who knows? Somebody knows. You take the penny doubling for 30 days. You might not think so, but if you actually get a computer and sit down and do it, you wind up with $2 million into 30 days. Now, the first 10 days or so, you're going to starve. But after 30 days, you will have. Albert Einstein once put it this way, compound interest is God's greatest gift to man. And now keep in mind, Albert Einstein was not even much of a believer of God. But anyway, what am I getting at? Well, you have 2 parents, 4 grandparents, 8 great-grandparents, 16 great-great-grandparents, 32, 64. Go back 30 generations, you have at least 2 million ancestors. Some of them might be the same. which basically means if you're European, or if you're Scottish like I am from Britain, probably every Britisher alive in the year 1000 who had any descendants, I'm probably related to, on one line or another. If you're African, probably every African who lived in your area in the year 1000, you're descended from, related to. Especially go back another 1,000 years, most of us are probably descended from everybody who was alive 2,000 years ago, on one line or another, whether we're white, black, or whatever. You follow the logic. Actually, though, I cannot trace my line lineage to the noble family of Cunningham. My great-great-grandfather came over here as a penniless ancestor, and though I'm not a bit ashamed of that, he was penniless and he died penniless. But a lot of his descendants have not. He gave a better life to me than I would have had he remained in Scotland, I'll put it that way. All right, leaving that, William was England's king. The next important king after William was Henry, the one who married Eleanor. Now, one of the things Henry did, he initially gave power to, he told the judges, you can judge according to Justinian's law, but if there's no law from Justinian to cover your case, make up a law. The Lord said, hey, this gives too much power to the judges, so Henry said, okay, from now on, no law can be passed unless the Lord's agreed. Now, I say that to say this. I wish that somebody in our country would rein in our judiciary, because in our country we will not have a democracy, we don't have it, as long as our judges make all of our moral decisions for us. Many a time, including very recently, our judges overturned the will of the people. They even overturned the Constitution one time. The 15th Amendment gave blacks the right to vote. The Supreme Court said, no, blacks don't have the right to vote. In effect, I mean, they used the excuse that blacks had to pass the literacy test or something or other. And the only way you pass the literacy test, folks, was to have a white skin. I mean, folk, I don't mean to open up old wounds, but some of you may have heard this already. I mean, this actually happened. But they even overturned the Constitution once. But they make all of our laws for us, and they make all the moral decisions for us. But in Henry's day, he reigned in the power of the judges. Now, but Henry made an attempt to solve some of the problems caused by the church. Basically, one of them, the church had all the lands. Also, the church said it had the right to appoint all the church offices. In other words, there were some issues going on. But Henry thought, I'm going to appoint my man as Archbishop of Canterbury. So the office of Archbishop of Canterbury, that's the highest church office in England. When the office became vacant, Henry appointed Thomas Becket, Henry's second. Now, here's the problem with it. Thomas Becket, he thought, I've got my man in office now. He'll do what I want. Thomas Becket was a worldly man, had never held a church title, but all of a sudden Henry said, hey, you're Archbishop of Canterbury. Well, guess what? Thomas Becket all of a sudden became what the king had made him. He started to dress like a churchman, to talk like a churchman, but even worse, he even had the mind of a churchman. All of a sudden he even became so churchy that even the Pope sent him a letter, hey, Thomas Becket, cool. I mean, we agree with you, but you're pushing things too fast, too hard. Just tone it down a little bit. In effect, that's what even the Pope said to him. Thomas Becket didn't even listen to the Pope. He said the church is right, we're going to hold on to what we have and not give in to the king a little bit. Well, Henry was sitting around a dinner table one time with some of his knights, and someone sent a message, hey, Thomas Becket did this, Your Majesty. Henry, in a fit of rage, well, none of you dogs who eat at my table take care of this upstart man for me. Now, Henry actually was just probably blowing off steam, but 4 knights took him at his word. They went to Thomas Becket, and they killed Thomas Becket. And this destroyed all of Henry's plans to reign in the church. Thomas Becket all of a sudden became a martyr. Henry had to bow before the priest and do penance. Even kings in those days did penance. Henry had to do penance for the rash deed. Henry got all the blame for it. The knights said we were acting on his orders. It's questionable where they were, but nevertheless, that's the way it came out. And if you visit England today and visit Westminster Abbey, you'll see a big statue to Thomas Becket that's been standing there for hundreds of years. He became a saint, a martyr, and Henry became the bad guy. Eventually now, the later English kings were able to somewhat rectify the problem and get things squared away. All right, now, I want to close with the last king that I'll talk about today, King John. Now, you may notice, I don't call him John the First. He will become John the First if there's ever a John the Second. The reason he's not John the Second is the royal family does not name his sons John, because they just simply don't like the memory of this man. King John was the worst king England had. He was a heavy drinker. He buddy-buddied around with a bad crowd. He ruled as he pleased. And all told, he had all kinds of vices with not any redeeming virtues to make up for them. He was an enemy to the Pope of his day, and that was a mistake, as the Pope of his day was Innocent III, the most powerful Pope who ever lived. He once even considered converting away from Christianity to Islam, but the Islamic cleric he wanted to send his emissary to would not accept him, said people should not change religions, wouldn't have him. But he had all kinds of problems. But one day, the people of England caught him gone. I mean, he had lands in France. He went over to France. When he came back, he found all the nobility from the highest to lowest against him. And he said, John, we've drawn up a charter here. We want you to sign. When John saw that everybody was against him, he signed. This charter is known as the Great Charter, or Magna. He signed the Magna Carta, which limited the power of the king. It says that the king, you may not do this, you may not do that, named about 15 things the king was not allowed to do. John signed it. Now, a lot of persons say that the reason that England still has kings today is right then they began to limit the power of their kings. Later on, they will limit the power of the kings still more, and then limit the power of the kings still more. Today, well, it's been about 25 or so years ago, Queen Elizabeth II expressed an opinion. And Margaret Thatcher scolded her soundly, rebuked her, said, you keep your mouth shut, you are not allowed to do that, you may not express an opinion on any political matter whatsoever. Even the private citizens are allowed to do that in England, but the Queen is not. That's how weak, I mean, today's kings and queens, before they make a speech, they get it approved by the Prime Minister. They're not allowed to speak without the Prime Minister's approval. But at least they still have a king and queen in England. Go to France, they don't have any kings anymore. Go to Germany, no king there. Go to Russia, no kings there. But England still has it because early in their history they limited the power of their king. And eventually they set up an institution called Parliament, not under John, but under a later king. And eventually Parliament became the governing body. At first, Parliament and kings shared their power, but then Parliament took over. Now, before it was over, Parliament was to exile 2 other kings, at least. Well, they put King Edward II in a monastery. They exiled King James II. They chopped off Charles I's head. But eventually the kings of England learned we must govern through Parliament. And they learned that lesson. So today there's still a king and queens in England. And there might be for some time to come, even though some people say England doesn't need the office of monarch anymore. And Queen Elizabeth II might be Queen Elizabeth last. But again, that's determined. That's for the future to determine. The royal family still makes news from time to time. All right, so much for that. Everybody have a good weekend.